All right, let's get started. We're excited to have this webinar on role of a clinical pharmacologist in setting regulatory strategy. And we have Jen here, who's going to present how she, in her profession, sets regulatory strategy for several drug development programs. So I welcome everybody to join um, who joined this webinar. Let's take a few housekeeping things. Today's webinar is being recorded. We invite your comments and questions. There is a chat box on the side you would see, and I would triage these questions to get Jen's opinion. And there will also be a opportunity for you to give feedback on the webinar at the end. What we're going to aim to achieve is for you to be able to list key clinical pharmacology strategy deliverables at the end of this webinar, understand the process of obtaining the knowledge to substantiate the strategy, and how is it done current practices. All right. Before I turn the podium to Jen, let me take the pleasure of introducing her. She is a senior vice president of clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics at RRD International. She has more than 22 years of experience. I know she doesn't look so, in drug development, focused in clinical pharmacology, biopharmaceutics, and regulatory affairs, and a wide range of development experience from small molecules, biologics, traditional 505(b)(1), B2, BLA, and biosimilar pathways across a broad range of therapeutic areas. She began her career at FDA, and that's when we first met and known each other since then. And in the division of antiviral drug products. And then she served as a clinical pharmacology reviewer for 7 years there. And following her tenure at FDA, she joined Salamandra and spent about 6 years as a senior clinical pharmacology expert and headed the clinical pharmacology group in terms of developing strategy and providing management oversight to clinical pharmacology programs. Currently, she's at RRD overseeing the clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics, and she continues to work with a wide variety of sponsors in clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics related matters and high-level strategy of development. She received her PharmD from Nebraska, University of Nebraska, College of Pharmacy. Following graduation, she did her pharmacy practice residency at the same university, and then completed a 2-year fellowship at University of Illinois College of Medicine, which was funded by the FDA. So with that introduction, I would like to start this webinar. We want to do a kind of a back and forth type question answer or dialogue format for this webinar. So Jen, thank you very much for joining this. I'm sure there are a lot of drug development folks and clin pharm folks, regulatory folks who are eager to learn from your experience. So let me start by asking you that from my interactions with you, very unique. You're a very unique professional in this area of clinical pharmacology who does not limit yourself to bioequivalence and drug-drug interactions, but think about registration strategies, pathways. So could you start by sharing your professional journey of how you have come to this stage in your career so that others can emulate if possible? Jen.
Thank you, Joga. Thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. I'd be happy to share them steps that shaped my career. So starting from the education, the decision to go get my doctorate in pharmacy was the first decision that started this career shaping process. I went on, as Joga said, and did a residency program at the Nebraska Medical Center. And there I was able to hone in on my clinical skills. I would round with the medical teams on the various floors that I was working on during my residency. I was staffing in an HIV ambulatory clinic under Dr. Susan Swindell's. And then once completing my residency program, I still really wanted to learn about research. So I applied for a clinical pharmacology fellowship at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. And I was fortunate enough to receive that position. And that was a very unique fellowship compared to the other ones that were listed for PharmDs. But this was something that FDA was actually funding. So they were paying my stipend to learn how to become a drug developer. And so that's really where I started getting the nuts and bolts of research. And I trained under two outstanding MDs that were board certified in clinical pharmacology. And they were excellent mentors for the 2 years. I again rounded with the pediatric intensivists during my fellowship. And I also staffed another HIV ambulatory clinic that they had at the medical school. And then finally, during my fellowship, I was given the opportunity to teach the class of antivirals to the M2 students, the medical year 2 students. And that was really fun to do. And I was able to take some additional graduate classes. But then I jump into the real world and I take a position at FDA after completing that. And honestly, that was the most critical step in my path to success. It's understanding the development landscape and the decision process of regulators was key for me. Again, I continue to work in the professional development with one half day a week. I would staff in a co-infection clinic at the DC Veterans Hospital, and that continued to keep my clinical skills up. I also had the opportunity to round with Dr. Fauci under his tutelage on the HIV ward at NIH, which was outstanding. And during my stay at FDA, and I'm sure Joga was involved with this, but you joined working groups to develop guidances. So next slide. So how do I come up with strategy deliverables? You know, the most important step, I think, for anybody that's going to be doing this type of job is you have to understand what the exit strategy is for the client or the inflection point. So regardless if it's a traditional 505b1 or a 505b2 pathway, you have to know, are they all in, or are they looking to get to proof of concept on a traditional pathway and then flip it to big pharma? Or in a 505b2, do they have the appetite to stay with the whole program if there's a clinical trial that they have to do, or do they just want to get that PK bridge and then hit the streets and see if they can't sell it? So understanding what the client's goals are important, and that comes from listening and asking the right questions. And finally, I always like to understand with my clients what their appetite is for doing regulatory meetings. I mean, I think meeting with FDA early and frequently to make sure your program stays on track is critical. So next slide, please. So after I left the FDA, my learning continued. So I had just enough to be really dangerous, as they would say, of skill sets when I left. But honestly, when you leave from the regulatory side and you jump into industry, it's a fast and furious learning curve. Just to give you some examples, to me, it was a huge difference to tell a sponsor as a regulator, you need to do this DDI, versus designing, placing the study at a study center, managing it, interpreting the results as being on the pharma side. That was a huge, huge difference for me. Again, it was a much heavier lift to piece together a full clinical pharmacology program versus sending out a template list of studies that most sponsors receive from FDA when they go in for a PIND, what's expected of the clinical pharmacology program. It's much different having to review a PIND or an IND submission or a briefing package from a sponsor versus authoring these modules. That was a huge learning curve for me. And then finally, attending an FDA meeting as a sponsor representative compared to what it was like as a regulator, completely different story. So those are key things that I really had to just be patient and learn how to do those. So next slide. So again, the clinical pharmacologist, how you can be helpful with setting the strategy. My biggest thing is I need to educate the client on what is expected. What is the threshold for clinical pharmacology? Some people have, a little bit of idea. Most clients that come to RD really are not have a lot of experience in the clinical pharmacology arena. So I really have to take the time to let them understand why I'm asking them to do the things that they need to do and what will happen if they end up kicking the can down the road. So typically what I like to do is I like to define the phase 1 studies that we have to do. And then I want to select the studies that add the most asset value, meaning creates a bandwidth or a runway for them to really keep moving in the clinical space while, plugging up some of the holes that you have to fill for phase 1. Then I'll create a to-do list with respect to the remaining phase 1 studies. And we will have a set schedule when we're going to trigger these, whether it's, around the POC time or if it's in parallel to phase 3. And then for me, the largest responsibility that any clinical pharmacology professional has to their client is to make sure when you sit down at that pre-NDA meeting that the program that you've done is complete and you get a green light to submit for an NDA. Next slide. So how can clinical pharmacologists improve? I think sometimes we don't think big enough. You've got to have an open mind, be more than one-dimensional. You can't just think it's just PK. I meet a lot of clinical pharmacology folks that all they talk about is clearance and volume and PK. It's not just PK. PK is a big part of it, but you have to relate the PK to the other areas of the program. And I think ways that you can do that is, number one, expand your knowledge. Expand, you might be a world-class modeler or a world-class, scientist, but what could you do to improve on how you look at the bigger program? I went down the clinical route. That doesn't mean everybody has to do that. You could be really good at statistical analyses. You could be really good at understanding the safety component, but think bigger. Try to have a broad area of knowledge, not just one expertise. Any clinical pharmacology work that I end up doing should always be adding value to the asset. I just don't do studies to do studies. I'm too busy to do that. So that's really important. That's when you have to be very thoughtful about the studies that you select and making sure that they are adding value to your client's asset. And finally, the most important advice that I've ever received, and I think I received this in pharmacy school, know what you don't know. And when you know what you don't know, you need to also know where you need to go to get the answer. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Jen. So if you're okay, I would like to quiz you a little bit to get to know some useful tips for other clinical pharmacologists out there. So the first I would like to start is by asking you that you did mention in your in your introduction that clinical pharmacology strategy is not about clearance, volume, half-lives, and drug interactions. I couldn't agree with you more. But can we start by discussing how can we make more gens? in clinical pharmacology, such that we not only care about the science part, but we equip ourselves with, to be a part of the uh, big decision making, at at the table, for strategy discussions, then, including even when to run the trials and how to run the trials, and like a holistic. So how can we have more of clinical pharmacologists prepared for such a role?
So I think, training wise, I kind of went through my steps, and I think that the steps are pretty quite clear. But I do think what I did after my training really, and the positions that I took, there was no mystery to that. I knew number one, if I started at the FDA, I would develop a very good foundation. And so that's number one that I would recommend is, think about that as a young scientist in school. Think about starting as a regular, as a clinical pharmacology reviewer. That's a really great stepping stone. You'll never regret that. I think once I felt that I wanted to be challenged more and I wanted to go outside the FDA, what I tried to do was to pick smart decisions. And so I wasn't really interested in going into big pharma. I wanted to be in a smaller company because you tend to wear more hats. So I jumped over to a smaller consulting firm in downtown Bethesda. And that honestly was baptism by fire. I mean, I had so many studies on day one, and I had never even designed one study in my life at that point. So that was a very fearful day for me, but it was something that I was bound and determined to make sure that I just, worked really hard to understand and learn the business. And so there's no mystery to that. So those are some key areas. I do think that when I was at FDA and I was allowed to go do that co-infection clinic staffing, here I am approving antiviral drugs, and I'm in the antiviral clinic. And those two things really wedded nicely for me because I was learning at both positions. So that was something that, if you can go out and take that extra step to try to hone in on your clinical skills, it really went a long way for me. And then when I was at FDA, Joga, you did this, you mentored fellows that came from Rutgers and NIH. I learned just as much from the fellows as they probably learned from me. So you've got to open up your mind and be willing to mentor young scientists, because that's what's going to make our profession just grow. And I'm in that point of my career now. I want to give back and mentor people, because I think the clinical pharmacology arena is such a dynamic arena, has such an important role in drug development, that I really want to continue to encourage young scientists to go into this field. And then finally, I want to talk about the company that I work with now, RRD International. We are a unique drug development company. So we're plug and play. We bring on assets from big pharma, biotech, and we do the development for the company. They certainly had the vision when they hired me. So there was no clinical pharmacology within RRD. I came to RRD under a non-compete clause from my former firm, so I could not bring any business with me. So I was like bare bones, nothing in my pockets, right, when I showed up. And they allowed me that time to build up my client base. I had to get all new clients. But the interesting thing is, when I was bringing in the clients, the upper management really started to notice that the clinical pharmacology arena really is a gateway that allowed for more business to come in for the other areas of the company. So they had the vision. They wanted to elevate me to senior management, bring on a team, and they wanted to build the business model around clinical pharmacology. So there's the history, and that's how I did it.
Amazing, amazing. So where do I sign up for this fellowship? Okay, so the next question I have is, uh, if we have to, if you have to use a typical project that you might have been involved with, um, it might help us to, if you can break down the how a clinical pharmacologist supports some, with a pivotal role in terms of setting the strategy. How do you break down the approach, the steps?
Great question. So again, the first step is I always start out, education, education, communication, communication. You got to do that with your client. You've got to give them the hard facts of, you may not like what I have to say, the things that you have to do, but if you wait and you kick this can down the road, that is one sure way to have your program come to a screeching halt. Okay, so FDA will let you go for a while, but if you get into phase 2 and starting to get into phase 3 and you've done none of the clinical pharmacology work, you will not proceed to phase 3 until that work is done. So that's a fact. So when I educate with the client, I'm taking the mystery out of what is clinical pharmacology. I don't know, Joga, if you've ever experienced this, but early on in my career, when I'd start talking about studies that we have to do, I would always see my clients' eyes glaze over. And so, that's when I knew I really had to take the time and help them understand why we have to do what we have to do. So I always like to start things out on a new project, understanding what they've done. They may not have done anything yet, but they may have done some things. And if they have, are there any holes in what they've done? So I'll do a gap analysis. And typically, any program that you're starting with, you start out in the non-clinical arena. And for us in ClinPharm, that means we're in the in vitro screens area. We're looking at early signals of the compound where we might have to worry about drug-drug interactions. And that's two sides of the coin. What other drugs might do to our drugs exposures and what our drug might do to their exposures. So we'll spend, 3 to 5 months in that area getting all the screen studies done. And so I will recommend, they'll either have some already done and I'll tell them where they have holes based on the guidance, or I'll be just giving them a whole list of studies that they need to do. The team that I have at RRD, they really, especially the pharmacometricians, they really like to start in the non-clinical space, meaning start leveraging the animal work to help them predict human exposures. And so if we are lucky enough to get into a program when they're at that stage in the non-clinical, our pharmacometricians start working at that point. And then, once you have your positive signals from your in vitro screens and you know what transporters or enzymes you have to worry about, then you start triggering and laying out the studies. And again, you don't always get to do everything at one time, but what I try to do, the critical studies first that are going to open up that runway for my client to proceed to proof of concept. And so that's kind of starting with the phase 1, early phase 1. And then when you start getting into proof of concept, we're involved in that as well. We're doing the dose justification. We're helping with the dose selection. We're developing the exposure response relationships. And that's going to support the dose selection that we would eventually take into phase 3. And there we are in phase 3. We're doing the same thing. We're involved. We're getting involved in the sampling of PK that we have to do for a POP PK or POP PK PD model. And sometimes it's just sparse samples. Other times, like for one client, we never had the whole elimination curve on any of our PK for any of the patients. And so what we have to do on this particular client, at the end, the very last dose the patients are taking in the phase 3 study, we're running out the PK out to about 96 hours because it has a 0 order elimination and we have to capture that whole tail. So we're involved. So just looking at this, anybody that's looking to get into clinical pharmacology, it's just not phase 1. It's just not non-clinical. It's through the whole program.
All right. So while we continue this, I encourage the audience to pose their questions in the chat box. I see one. We'll get to it in a minute, James. So then, given that, a process of setting a strategy as a clinical pharmacologist, Typically, what does your day look like?
This is a dynamic process, Joga. It changes. Last night at 08:30, I got an FDA IR response. Okay, so that's my day. I thought I was done, but no, I'm on the calls with my clients, and I'm on the calls with my pharmacometricians. One of my pharmacometricians was cutting down a Christmas tree when I called him. So, so it's never doesn't stop, but. Typical day, I mean, it could be that I'm attending BD opportunity calls with senior management, talking to new potential clients. I could be attending budget calls. If we have new projects coming in and we're putting together a project across the various disciplines, I will be involved in that. I typically attend weekly calls where we have ongoing activity with clients. Could be a phase 1 study, could be preparing for an end of phase 1 meeting. Whatever the case, we have weekly calls with clients. Calls with the study sites where we have active ongoing studies, we do that weekly, or also with my in vitro labs to discuss some of the screen study results. Answering DDI questions for principal investigators for phase 3 trials that I'm part of. That are ongoing. So we have a global trial that just completed, but since 2019, I have been receiving easily 6 to 8 emails a week from various PIs asking if they could give certain concomitant meds with the drug that we were developing. Meeting with my ClinPharm and pharmacometrics team to go over our weekly deliverables. Some days we're getting concentration data back from bioanalytical labs and getting my pharmacometric teams queued up to get the ANOVAs and the NCAs done. Meeting with my senior management team, internal calls with medical writing and reg affairs, or, reviewing new client data in a share room because we're getting ready to do a gap analysis or start a new development strategy. Every day is different, Joga. So many different things.
Okay. Before I continue with the questions I prepared, let's answer the question from James, one of the attendees. He's asking that in a nutshell, he's asking, that's great, you had the opportunity to work at the FDA, but what about the other folks who may or may not have the opportunity to work at the FDA? How do you get this kind of a regulatory mindset?
Well, I think that's a great question, James. There's pre-pandemic, there was probably DIA meetings, and I would watch the FDA website for meetings. I know that I've attended several, like in the infectious disease arena and things. Anytime you see something that FDA is doing, providing an open seminar, whether and if it's dealing with something in our particular wheelhouse, I would sign up and go to it. I would also advise, if there's advisory committee meetings, things like that, listening to that back and forth between the experts and the agency, you kind of start understanding how decisions are made. That's a way. I always like to start new employees out with reading the guidances. Guidances are a great source of information.
Especially if you cannot fall asleep.
Yeah, some of them are long. You might have, they're great for nighttime reading, right? But those are another outstanding way to start understanding the nuances and things that FDA asks you to do. I hope that helps.
If I may add a little bit my own perspective, is that I always encourage the clinical pharmacologist to take a couple of summary basis of approvals and really read them thoroughly, and not start with ClinPharm, but start with the summary, supervisory review, then go down the path to understand. So strategy is basically how do you take a molecule and get it approved the way you want it, right? So by it's like a legal case basically. So you're understanding the the dynamics of the legal case, or in this case, the regulatory review, is an immense library out there, but it's underutilized. So that's something you may want to look at to James and others. All right. Well, let's continue our journey. I'll try to kind of, in the interest of time, improvise and prioritize the questions if that's okay with you, Jen. Yeah,
that's fine.
So if it would be great if you can exemplify by sharing one or two types of problems or projects or opportunities for us that you might have dealt with, which exemplifies what you have been advocating in terms of clinical pharmacology plus strategy.
So, with respect to development decisions, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the types of problems you are called to solve, basically.
So, for example, I've got several that I can talk about. I mean, it really depends on where the client is in their development, but like early on in their development, we have a situation where we have a new novel formulation for a 505(b)(2), where we were trying to generate information in the translational space that would help us predict what our human exposures will be, right? But we couldn't get all the absorption rates and things like that from one of the studies that we did in the non-clinical space. So how do we find out if the formulation that they have right now is going to hit that mark? And so talking with my client, I said, well, short of doing a pilot PK, we're never going to know. So this is something that you could do, a pilot PK, just to look at where your exposures land and just a handful of subjects, very inexpensive study. And that way, if you're not hitting the mark, then you still need to optimize your formulation steps. So that's one example. Have a 505(b)(2) client that really works very hard in the pilot space with really trying to generate the right formulation that they hit their BE mark in their pivotal. And our pharmacometrics group really works hand in hand with this group, helping them with this, the decision on which tablet strength to use that will give them their best shot at being bioequivalent. And they do this by getting heavily involved, doing some bootstrap ANOVAs for BE and calculate the success and fail rate of hitting that 90% BE range of 80 to 125. So those are some unique situations that we're involved with. I have more, but I don't want to, take too much time.
Thank you. There is a question from the audience, and it's how do you handle clients who do not wish to run as many clinical PK DDI interaction studies and still want everything be done tomorrow?
That's a great question. That is the motto, isn't it? I mean, that is typically when you say you need to run a $500,000 study and they don't still see the need. But I do think there is much more traction today from the regulators on pushing for the clinical pharmacology work to be done. And so the answer to your question, sometimes you can't convince them. But at the end of the day, they're going to come back to you because they're going to be stalled. Okay, so you can do your best. You can lay out the pros and cons, and that's kind of what I do. Listen, you don't want to do this now. If you go into your phase 3, these are all the I's and E's that you're going to have to, inclusion, exclusion criteria, you're going to have to list, and your study is going to be very difficult to enroll. So, there's certain ways to kind of lead the horse to the water. But again, there are some, I just had a situation where you just couldn't move somebody off of it. And at some point you just have to let go and let them find their own way, because they're not going to go much further without doing this work. So the best you can communicate and help them understand why they need to do it, that has worked for me, being successful.
All right. Thank you.
I see his follow-up. Does MIDD answer these pain point situations? I think the MIDD is a really great tool But most of my clients don't want to wait that long for all those meetings and questions. And that's one way to really slow down your drug development program. If you have a client that's not in a hurry, that modeling informed drug development pilot program is a great program. But for most of my clients, it moves a bit too slow for them.
Okay. I might add to the program, and there is a similar question from Richard. You might see about the MIDD paired meeting program. So, I'm involved with almost most of the MIDD meetings so far at the FDA. I think they are wonderful, and it shows the commitment of the agency on modeling and simulation and pharmacometrics, and some very important strategic questions were brought to these meetings, which would not have been suitable, I would say, because it involves a heavy dose of pharmacometrics, and there, in general, the sponsors have benefited, and you get two shots. If it's not resolved, then you get another meeting in 60 days. So I love it, and you will too.
I think it's a great meeting. It's just hard to convince clients to wait for those meetings. That's the timing for my clients. It didn't work for their.
I can understand goals. That, and that is that's the maybe if we want to prioritize MIDD, you want to prioritize MIDD for really high level, very important decisions where the cost of not having the meeting is going to be years and millions of dollars and that kind of stuff.
Correct.
So for example, there was a case where there was a surrogate marker based efficacy for efficacy to be approved. They couldn't do the study even if they wanted to. There's no other way. You have to go through the MIDD to get that, as an example. But what you allude to about the logistic challenges in matching the timelines of the project versus the regulatory process, yes, that's valid. So awesome. Okay, so we're kind of probably mixing a lot of things in this discussion, which is perfectly fine. So I'm sure you are included in strategy discussions within your organization as well as with the clients. So when do you typically get involved in these strategic discussions?
I typically get involved pretty early on, Joga. Typically any strategy calls with new clients, I will be on the call. Any issues or questions with a clinical pharmacology program that arises, whether it be regulatory, medical writing, data management, I will be included on the call to weigh in. Clients actually request my attendance oftentimes when they are speaking to other vendors like formulators, because sometimes when you have a meeting with a formulator, they don't understand the nuances of the route of administration and the things that you need to be concerned about. So I will be involved in those calls to answer questions from the formulators about the dosing and things like that. I will also get on. I attend calls with clients that are looking to sell their asset. I help them with the due diligence. We've done that several times at RRD. Help sell an asset that was at proof of concept. I can be brought in also on SAEs, during study conduct. So it's quite a bit of different things that I'm called in on. But strategy calls with new clients, I would probably say, is very important to have a ClinPharm member there, especially if it's like early development.
All right. So there is a question from the audience. Um, can you highlight your experience, I guess, with most common but subtle strategic trip points that occurred that clients and
With,
practitioners should be on the lookout, and maybe a few tricks of the trade to proactively address? Is that clear?
I know I didn't
Yeah.
understand anything you
So
just.
I was just verbatim reading the question. So I guess the question, maybe I'll paraphrase it. What James is asking is that during your discussions with the clients, are there any general traits, tips, or general uh, pointers that you suggest to us to keep in mind when discussing strategy with clients? It's a broad question. I give it to you, but if it is possible for you to answer, otherwise we can ask for an explanation.
I mean, I think when you're talking to clients, try to stay out of the weeds. Okay, stay out of the weeds. Keep the the flow of the conversation, above that. Concept, concepts are really good to talk on a first time basis, as far as, even if you see something, even if I see something that makes my eye twitch that they've done, I won't focus in on that. I'll, might bring something up that we might have to look at that, but keep the topics broad. Make sure that you say enough that enough information is provided to them that they understand what you're talking about. But I would not get down in the weeds on you know not that things aren't going to matter, but first impressions, they want to know, your experience. They want to know what you can do. They're not looking for you to get down into the weeds. So it's more of keep things up, talk big concepts with them, why we do clinical pharmacology, why it's expected that you do a SAD MAD, why you have to do the screen studies. You don't have to get down in the weeds, but you have to say, listen, you've got to think about the patient population that you're going into. And these people are going to be taking this drug, but they're also going to be probably taking an antidepressant. They're also going to be taking something for hyperlipidemia. They're also going to be taking something for diabetes. So you got to understand how all those drugs are going to play together in the same person and in the same patient. And if you explain that to the client, that it's, more of a safety issue, you have to understand how these drugs are going to interact. That has been very successful for me getting these DDIs done. So just don't get into the weeds. Try to keep things more broad when you first initially talk to a client, and don't give too much information away for free either. You want to keep having them coming back. So
Okay, so I hope that addresses the question, James. So just to summarize where we are so far in this discussion dialogue, we started with, you know, um, who you are, your professional journey, and what uh, what milestones led to the current position you have and experience you have. And then we talked about broad strokes. What does strategy entail? What type of problems we solve? But if you allow me, if we want to take a little bit deeper dive into the weeds, so you said gap analysis and such is are the ones that you would consider for strategy, developing a strategy. If you break it down, for example, how do you perform these? You know, prepare
the gap
yeah,
analysis.
and inform the strategy based on that.
Well, so the gap analysis is when I talk about, and I kind of refer to it as a forensic gap analysis. Number one, sometimes the clients that come to RD really don't have much developed. They're just starting, okay? But then there's some that come in with a lot of, they may have purchased an asset and they've got the old studies that were done years ago, but you got to go through and look at everything that's been done under the clinical pharmacology hood, right? And then, but I always start, okay, have they done their in vitro screens? Because I never take that as a resounding yes. I'm sure everybody has done these, because typically they have not. So what I try to do is I go into their IB, I look in their data room for reports to see if there's anything about in vitro screens, because that's really where our work starts. Because you have to understand, how is this drug metabolized? How much of the drug is disappeared during the metabolic stability testing? And what enzymes cause that disappearance? All right. So that's the first thing. And then what I do is, knowing what is required by FDA, because it's clearly outlined in the guidance, you put together a roadmap of all the transporter and CYP enzyme in vitro testing that you need to do. Fine, that's done. If it's not done, you can't predict right now how many DDI studies you're going to have, because you have to wait till the study's done. But you can then think about, okay, we can assume they might have 1 or 2 DDIs, maybe 1 or 2 positive signals will come out of these screen studies. But what other studies do we have to do? Well, if it's a new molecular entity, you got to do a SAD/MAD. You got to go in and do a single ascending and multiple ascending dose studies. That's usually the first. And that is the best study to really focus in on and gathering robust PK data, because that study you're going to be able to leverage that data to do so many other things. You can leverage that to do modeling and simulation for doses that you haven't even looked at in vivo, right? So always that SAD/MAD is one of the first studies. Then you know that food effect, if you don't get that out of the way early, right, you're going to be giving this drug to patients and you don't know if a food effect is going to change the exposure. So not that you have to do a pivotal food effect, but I might throw an arm in on a SAD/MAD and just do a quick little food effect just to get a signal, right? Because then you kind of know, well, exposures are a little bit higher, but there's no safety risk. So maybe we want to do it with food, to hit the mark that we need to hit. So those are how I kind of think of things. And then I just kind of go down the list of studies that are required. You have to do intrinsic, extrinsic factors. You're going to have to, if it's a new molecular entity, you've got a high precision QTC study on your plate. Depending on how this drug is cleared, it's going to be hepatic or renal impairment, special populations. And oh, by the way, if you're going into a population that has hepatic impairment and your drug is cleared via hepatic means, then you're going to have to do the special population long before you get into phase 3. So this, I have a tablet of paper and I just kind of write down the studies. And then that will eventually go into a slide deck that we will share with the client, But that's the methodical. I start at the beginning of a drug program and I take it to what we're doing all the way to phase 3. And I scribe it out on a pad. Is that helpful?
Yes, definitely. Then there's a question from the audience. I will paraphrase it for you. Essentially, the question is that, are there any examples where this kind of a gap analysis and strategy driven by you really made a huge difference in the final outcome? I'm dropping the phrase, big pharma out of this, because an example is an example.
Yeah.
So is it clear?
Well, there's lots of examples where this has been very helpful for us. Just on a recent one, we were looking at a new asset coming in that's from Japan, and one of my clinical pharmacologists realized that one of the tox studies was done in an animal that didn't have a certain enzyme that they needed to metabolize this. So that's a problem, right? So when you're looking at things like that, I mean, you do find errors that have happened. Yes. So gap analysis is always, so if you're taking on a program that you didn't start and it might be mid-cycle, very important to do a gap analysis, because you just don't know what the previous group that they were working with missed. I would never rely on that. I always have to make sure that, I go back and make sure the boxes have been checked. But, with respect to, has it ever made a difference? It does make a difference, because if you don't go and do your homework and understand what is not complete, and then you go forward with a pre-NDA meeting, they're going to point out to you at that time where your holes are in your program. So that's what my most fearful thing that could happen to me is showing up with my client at a pre-NDA and say, well, why didn't you do this? Why isn't this done? And that has not happened to me to date, knock on wood. And I think a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened is because of the gap analyses that we do.
Okay. So I, as a follow-up, what I'm hearing from your conversations is that for this gap analysis to be effective, not only you need to have the expertise, in-depth expertise in the clin pharm area, that's from our training, but you need to have reasonable understanding to ask the right questions across the drug development. Is that a hidden message that you're advocating?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, that's it. If you think it, ask it, because I don't think a client's ever going to get upset to answer a question. I mean, I think that's what you're being paid to do, is to make sure that you're keeping them on track for their development program.
Yeah. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. So we'll do a couple of questions. There are a couple of questions from the audience, but I want to ask you a final question from my side, which is that when you are proposing a kind of a precedent setting, right? If somebody is coming and saying, how many studies do you want? And the FDA says 2, no, I'm going to do 3, no problem. but if you're going in with a proposal to the client as well as to the agency with a precedent setting, meaning there are nothing that was done before on those lines, is there a special preparation that one has to go through compared to a general strategy?
I mean, I don't think that I would ever go into a meeting with FDA with the development program proposal without understanding, even if there isn't precedent, you try to look around to see if anything comes close to what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, when I go in with strategic questions and lay out my plan, number one, the PIND meeting is the most important, because you're going to gain the clarity around that program. So you ask the tough questions. Now, I have some clients that don't want to ask tough questions. They're afraid to get the answer sometimes, but I always try to persuade them, this is your opportunity to get clear direction. And so why not ask it? So, and then I'm going to take a step back. When we're preparing the briefing package, Joga, it's very important about the way you ask the questions. We spend a long time being very deliberate about the language we're using with each question, because you can ask a question and you think it sounds clear, but you end up with a really lukewarm response from FDA, meaning they didn't get to the point that you were trying to ask. So we really dissect that and make sure that our questions are going, the way they're crafted will get us the feedback that's needed, right? With respect to going in, I always want to go in with a well-defined program. I don't want FDA telling me what to do. I mean, I don't want to ask them. I think going in and showing that you have a handle on things, you're confident, you think that this is the right pathway. It's not to say that they may say, no, we want you to do it this way, but I don't want to ask them to do my work. Does that make sense to you? You want to go in and you want to show them that you've done your homework. You've got this program, and you feel very confident that this is somewhere close to what they're going to want. So with respect to precedent, you know, that there's nothing out there for precedent, that doesn't mean that I won't go look around for something similar. Just to, I mean, I always try to. And honestly, I don't know how many times I've really found something that's exactly like what I'm looking for. But you extrapolate and interpolate. You know, you kind of look at what you're looking at and how does that fit my program? You know, it fits maybe 60%. How, you know, that's how I kind of do it. It's not perfect science, but it's a way to get a sound development plan into a briefing package that the FDA can weigh in on.
Cool. Where do you look though? Where would you look? Meaning, how do you find this?
Oh, where would I look? Oh, obviously VivPro.
No,
That's what we have
general,
in house.
concepts,
No, VivPro. I will look on clinicaltrials.gov. I'll go to the FDA website, but it gets a bit harder to search there. But if I do find something in VivPro with the SBA, what I end up trying to do is going into FDA and grabbing that, because you get some really good little nuggets if you read, like you suggested to one of the questions. Pick an SBA and start reading it. There's a lot of decision-making language in those SBAs that you can pick up on. And that's what I try to do.
So there are a couple of questions, but can I request you, the audience, the folks who are asking the question, to follow up via email after this webinar? We have only 2 minutes left, so we can get back to you on those questions. If you see there's an email posted in the chat box, Holly can coordinate, triage these questions for you. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to announce the next webinar, which is by Khushbu Sharma. She's a Chief Regulatory Innovation Officer at Accumulus Synergy. And you can register the same way that you registered for this program. She will be talking about reimagining drug development with transformative approach to regulatory submissions. That's January 12th in the new year, 2023, similar time, noon. Next slide, please. And then we also wanted to introduce you to a conference that's coming up at University of Maryland on setting regulatory, R&D strategy and the role of intelligence on January 23rd and 24th. This is going to be in Baltimore live, so you could register for that workshop. Everybody with stellar credentials from the agency as well as from pharmaceutical companies are speaking at this event. So with that, I would like to thank Jen for taking time to share her journey and also insights into how she sets and leads the strategic planning for new drug development programs. And I hope it was useful, and that you could take some messages home that we can apply to our own professional growth. Thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you, Joga. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.